else you want to add before we start the formal recording?
No, I think we're good.
Well, greetings. Welcome, everybody. Again, my name is Eric Giordano. I'm the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service. And this presentation is really being conducted through one of our arms known as WIPS Research Partners. WIPS Research Partners addresses community and organizational needs by providing a full spectrum of academic and technical resources of the University of Wisconsin system and beyond, using proven research methods and people-centered approaches. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to our presenter today, Sharon Belton, who is the Director of WIPS Research Partners and a Senior Policy Fellow for WIPS.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Good morning, everyone. I really appreciate all of you taking time out of what is a very busy week for many people to hear the findings of our study on the voices of Marathon County students returning to school during COVID-19. One of the most interesting things about this project is the real need for students to have a voice in the process of returning to school, especially during the uncertain times that we're facing with COVID. And you'll see sprinkled throughout my presentation today some of the direct quotes that we heard from the student participants. And sort of carried through the theme of today's presentation is a sense from students that decisions about returning to school are being made for them, but without them. And they really want to have a say or opportunity to engage in the process. And the findings and sharing the findings of this project are really just one way for us to try to communicate what we heard from the students about something that really has a material impact on them and on their daily lives. So before we get in to the details of the findings, Eric did a nice job kind of introducing who we are at WIPS Research Partners. A couple of things that I want to emphasize is that, really our goal in doing this project is to help the community make more informed decisions about the topic of school reopening. And while this project had a central Wisconsin or Marathon County focus, we think that a lot of the findings have implications for school districts across the country and even across the state of Wisconsin. So others can learn from the information that we're sharing as well. I think it's also important to make the point that WIPS Research Partners values objectivity, credibility, and transparency. Our goal in conducting this project was not to take any positions on what schools should do or how they should do it or make policy recommendations. Our role really was to provide a sound foundation of information that others can use to make more informed decisions about this issue. The project purpose and the goals of what we're trying to do really are very simple. As we all know, and as has been the case for the last several months going throughout the summer, school districts are spending considerable time and effort and care and thought weighing return to school policies and approaches. And one thing that we had noticed at WIPS Research Partners was that there was very little, if anything, that was being captured or reflected in the decision-making process about students' concerns or perspectives. Many school districts have conducted surveys of teachers, staff, and parents, but we really couldn't find anything that was capturing the concerns and the perspectives of students. And as far as we can tell, this is one of the first, if only, studies to really take a student-centered perspective at the middle and high school levels. And so really we sought to fill an information gap, as I said, to help make more informed decisions. And over the last week or so, we've been really trying to share the findings of this project with area school leaders, parents, and the community. And we hope that by having this presentation today, that's just one step in trying to get this information out there to those who are in a position to use the information. So the methodology that we used in this project was a focus group approach. And focus groups are really a qualitative research method that is very well suited to getting really deep and nuanced information about how people feel and why they feel the way they do. We purposely did not use a survey methodology in order to really be able to get at the dynamics of what students were thinking and why they were thinking what they expressed to us. We captured students from diverse backgrounds representing 47 middle and high school students from across Marathon County. You could see the broad representation of schools that had students participating in the project. We conducted 5 two-hour virtual WebEx discussions over a 5-day period in early August, and really made a considerable effort to analyze the data quickly and synthesize it so that it would be timely related to the discussions that are happening related to schools starting back up, and in many cases in the next several days or early next week. It's important to note that support for this project really came from a joint partnership from WIP's research partners, as well as the COVID-19 Community Response Fund of the Community Foundation of North Central Wisconsin and the United Way of Marathon County. And I want to really acknowledge the foundation and the United Way for the very quick response that they gave us to being able to provide the support that we needed to do this project. Within, honestly, several days of identifying the need for the project, we were able to secure the funding and get going with the research project, which with something like this, you know, had we had to take more time, the information wouldn't be as relevant to the discussions that are going on. So we really appreciate and thank them for their support. So before we get into the meat of the findings, I want to make 2 important points that are relevant to understanding the students' discussions and thoughts that they express to us. When we talk about returning to school in the context of this project, what we're really referring to is classes resuming in the fall. So returning to an academic or a learning environment, regardless of the format or the approach that the school was taking. So for many students, returning to school meant being physically on site. For others, it meant being virtual, or it meant being a blend of both virtual and on site. And for students, the term virtual is really a shorthand terminology for not learning at school. And for some, that meant being in a virtual school or academy, online school, remote learning, e-learning, learning from home. So when students use the terminology virtual, or when we use the terminology virtual in the context of this study, we're not referring specifically to a narrow set of learning environments that are related to a virtual school or academy. We're really capturing any kind of situation where students are not learning at school. So starting to get into what did we learn from students? What are they thinking and what are they feeling? I can't underscore enough the extent to which the students that we spoke with were expressing feelings of stress and anxiety about returning to school. This was probably the most compelling theme that ran through all of the discussions that we had with students, and it manifested itself in many different ways, from anxieties about their learning environment to anxieties related to maintaining their social connections with friends. And you could see here just a few of the comments that students expressed to us about this. And one that really struck me in particular was, you know, when we asked students to rate on a scale of 1 to 10, you know, how worried were they, or how worried are they about returning to school? And one student mentioned that on a scale of 1 to 10, he was a 4 related to his safety, but a 7 related to his future. And that underscored a theme related to students, while being very concerned about COVID and safety, really thought about returning to school from a much broader perspective. So getting at this in a little more detail, I think that, you know, one of the takeaways from this project is a real need to understand the baseline level of anxiety, stress, and uncertainty that is kicking off the start of this school year is very high. And I think it's higher than what it would normally be if we were starting school in a typical, school year. And as I said, while safety was definitely top of mind for the students, they expressed greater concerns about their learning than they did about safety related to COVID-19. And we'll talk about, what was the nature of their concerns about learning in a minute. One thing that really came out of the discussion at both the high school and the middle school groups, but in particular for the middle school ages, was really a fear of the sudden and unpredictable changes in learning environments that students might be facing, going into this school year. And that is a combination of things. Students who were returning to school in person expressed some anxiety related to things suddenly shutting down and returning to school from home. And then those that were starting in a virtual environment expressed some concern and anxiety about what the factors are or the criteria would be for when school would resume in person. And I think that I was particularly struck by how students had processed the very sudden nature with which schools were shut down in the spring, and how that was almost for many a very traumatic event that they were expressing anxiety about with respect to going into the school year ahead. And they had some very specific ideas about what would help alleviate some of the stress and anxiety that they were feeling. Very tangible things like they wanted to know what their schedules would be. What would their daily routines be like? Many expressed a concern about being able to learn actively with their teachers, not just on their own at home with, packets or worksheets. They also want to be able to get help with their assignments. And being able to access their teachers for help on assignments was really something very important to students, and something that they had negatively experienced in the spring with respect to it being a roadblock in terms of being able to stay focused on what they were working on. They want to know specifically how they will be able to connect with their friends in the social context of schools, and they want to know more about what schools will be doing to keep them safe. So to sum it all up, really, the devil is in the details, if you will, with respect to COVID-19, and students, wanting to know those specifics and the details and sort of fill in the blanks in their mind about what school is going to be like in the fall. And I know schools are working very hard on all of these things, and the hope would be that in time, some of those blanks will be filled and students will feel more comfortable. The next area that students talked about was really, their concerns about learning and how they'll get support in a virtual environment. And again, for students, a virtual environment could encompass anything from being in a blended model to being 100% in a virtual academy, or a sudden shift to, school at home as a result of COVID. There was a very interesting range of perspectives that were provided about working at home during the spring. Many students saw some positive aspects of it with respect to having independence and flexibility, but also concerns about what that kind of environment would be going forward, and a very real sense that they don't want to be tied to their computer all day and follow a rigid schedule. So balancing that flexibility and independence with a need for routine and structure was very important to the students. When we talked to students about the learning environment going into the fall, one of the most compelling themes that we heard from the students is that they wanted all students to have options and choices with respect to their learning environment, including the option to be learning on site. Many recognized that what might work for them from a learning perspective might not work for their friends or for their peers. And being able to provide students a learning environment where they felt that they could best thrive, whether that be at home or at school, was really a theme that they wanted communicated in the context of this project. Many of the students, particularly at the high school levels, expressed significant concerns that they had about learning gaps that they experienced during the spring, either units that they missed or that had to be left out of the curriculum that they were exposed to, has made them worried that they're not prepared to go into the fall school season and what impact that might have on their future. And that wasn't just, going to college, it was also how missing out on the educational and the learning experience might impact their future career plans. For example, one student mentioned the inability to access particular internship opportunities that had been planned for her in the spring and going into this fall that were directly related to a career that she was pursuing. And that was generating a lot of anxiety for her about how she'd be able to continue on with her career plan. As I mentioned, it was a very real concern for students that they want to be able to balance flexibility and independence with structure and routine with respect to the learning environment in the fall. They really want active learning with teachers and with their fellow students, whether that be through regular small group discussions with teachers and peers that are held virtually, smaller in-person groups, informal ways to access teachers through online forums. They don't want busy work. They don't want tasks. They want the active learning that they've come to associate with, with being in school. And as I mentioned earlier, getting timely academic support is really critical to their ability to be successful in a virtual environment and not feel like they get stuck on something and have to put it aside. It really is very relevant to their ability to be productive. Another thing that the students mentioned that they wanted school leaders to know was that learning from home or in a virtual environment can be very overwhelming with respect to the number of emails that they're getting from teachers, the number of different platforms they have to manage, from WebEx to Zoom to Google Meets to Infinite Campus to Canvas to It's Learning. It became very difficult for some students to try to manage and keep up with and keep track of all of the different communications that were coming at them from different directions. And in some cases, it just became too overwhelming. And I think for some students, it would just cause them to check out of the learning process. And finally, it can't be overstated enough the significant benefits of the extra sleep that the students expressed with respect to the learning from home environment. Many students felt that the ability to have some flexibility with respect to the school day and be able to get that extra sleep was central to their ability to manage the school from home environment, and also helped improve their overall mental health with respect to, the stressful nature of the school environment. So we've talked about the learning environment and the underlying theme of anxiety. Another very compelling theme from the focus groups has to do with the social and emotional needs that students have going into the fall school year. One student expressed this as a feeling that for her, virtual is scary, both mentally and socially. And we heard this from many students that they were feeling, even now, going into the school year, a sense of disconnectedness from their friends, from their peers, that they're feeling lonely, and they want and are craving those connections with other people that the school environment provides. And for some, it really was taking a toll on them from a social emotional standpoint. And one thing that we talked about with respect to this issue was not only just being able to connect with students, and students, I think, have a very clear understanding of the safety implications of being connected. it doesn't necessarily have to mean an in-person connection. It could be finding creative ways to provide sort of informal ad hoc ways for students to connect with each other virtually through Google Meets or Google Hangouts, or even at the middle school level, they suggested providing a Discord server for students that had particular interests. They could just hop on and interact with each other, and just providing some informal connections that would be safe, either in person or virtually, for them to get those social experiences that they really want from school. We had very detailed discussions about the extracurricular and co-curricular activities that students benefit from in a school environment. And while there were, some students that felt like if an activity couldn't be provided safely, it shouldn't be offered, but the overwhelming hope of students was that schools, with their help, would be able to get creative to offer the clubs, the sports, the band, and the arts, all of the things that they love about school without canceling them outright. And this could be something as simple as providing band in a virtual environment, or having clubs meet virtually, having them meet in small socially distant groups outside. They're really wanting schools to try to offer these activities without canceling them. And this really came through in a very clear way when we discussed the potential loss for student athletes of their sports. This was a very significant concern for the students that we talked to who participate in sports and have a very real concern that they won't be able to continue with their sport this fall. And for many, the discussion about sports and activities went hand in hand with student comments related to a need for mental health support, a need for more access to counselors, the need for school psychologists to play a more visible role in the student population in general, and maybe not just students who have an identified need for counseling support. And this may be an area where the community at large can come together to help provide some of the mental health support that students need when trying to be successful in learning in this kind of environment. Obviously, a project like this wouldn't be complete without a discussion of students about what they're concerned about with respect to their safety. And we'll talk about their thoughts about safety from a comprehensive standpoint, but one of the most important things that we heard from students that would signal to them that schools were doing what they could to make them safe had to do with providing a mask policy. And that's not to say that every student that participated in the focus groups felt that masks should be mandatory or that students should be forced to wear masks, but the overwhelming message from students would be that masks would provide them with the peace of mind, if they are in an on-site setting, that their schools were doing what they could to make them safe. And this tied into a bigger theme, as I touched on in the beginning, that the students really want to know the details of their school's safety plan. What will the schools look like? What protocols will they need to follow? What will they need to do? How will the schools maintain social distancing? And what was very interesting about the discussion about safety is that in talking about the school's safety plan and masks and all of the other things related to COVID-19, while students did have a personal concern about their own safety, they expressed greater concern for the safety of others than they did for themselves. And this had to do with a safety concern related to teachers and staff that would be interacting with them in the building, and also for family members who might be at risk if COVID were to be brought home from the school environment. And so I think this was really a hopeful message that the students conveyed, is they expressed great empathy for others about the potential risks of COVID and what they could do as individuals to help others in the community be safe. As I mentioned, for many students, having a mandatory mask policy is essential, an essential signal that they will be safe at school. And from the students' perspective, the comments that they provided really underscored the need for schools, or whatever environment students would be in, to clearly articulate the rationale for why masks would be required, or whatever the mask policy that the organization decided to follow, whether it would be mandatory or optional. Explain that rationale to the students and have clear rules and enforcement policies in place for what to do if students didn't adhere to whatever the policy was that the school decided to follow. The other safety components that students talked about that they felt were critical if they were in charge of a school to making it safe would be to provide students that choice to be in an all virtual environment if for some reason they had an underlying health condition that would make being on site at school difficult for them, or if they had family members that would make being on site difficult, or if they just felt more personally comfortable being at home. We've talked about masks. The other two areas that really rose to the top across all of the focus groups that we conducted were the need for access to hand sanitizer, hand washing opportunities, and real deep cleaning of the schools, especially the bathrooms and areas where students congregate. And students really, they want to know how the schools will be maintaining physical distancing, especially in the hallways, in the classrooms, and in the common areas and during lunch. So that kind of summarizes the anticipation of returning to school from the safety standpoint. The last area that I want to touch on has to do with real frustrations on the part of students with respect to communication coming from schools to them. Students express this in two ways. Many don't feel like they're getting information about what their school's plans are and what the details are, and they're feeling like they don't have a say or input into the process of returning to school. They feel like they're not being treated like they're part of the conversation. And I think this is a real opportunity for school leaders and other organizations to engage students in the process as school's starting back up in a few weeks. Obviously, this will be a very fluid and dynamic situation. There's opportunities to seek out student input and engagement in the process. It's very clear that the students in Marathon County that we spoke with have a very high level understanding of COVID-19. They had a very sophisticated understanding of the issues, and they were able to talk about these issues, and share very clear differences of opinion in very thoughtful, respectful, and non-political ways. Both Eric and I are political scientists by training, and I think we were both struck by the way in which this generation and these students, regardless of their background, regardless of what school they were coming from, didn't get into the politically divisive discussions that you might see in the media and you might see many adults personifying with respect to very real differences and political divides related to policies related to school reopening. They were very, very thoughtful, very respectful, and in all cases acknowledged each other's differences of opinion. So I think that's a very hopeful message that we can take away from this project. At the time when we conducted these focus groups in early August, so several weeks before school was starting, we heard from many students that they just simply had no idea or were completely unaware of what their school's plans are with respect to school reopening. They didn't know, and I would say it was about 50% of the students, didn't know if their school would be in person, completely virtual, some blend of it in between, and this was causing them a lot of stress. And many of them acknowledged that information might have been sent from the schools to their parents, but that information isn't necessarily going from the parents to the students. We did have several students who actively participate and watch school board meetings or try to seek out information on their own. But for the most part, the students are hoping that the schools will try to reach them directly, particularly at the high school levels. This could mean a Q&A session with the school principal, where the students would have an opportunity to ask questions. More information coming from students who might be in leadership roles within their schools and communicating to other students. They really want more opportunities to get information, not just through email, which many students acknowledge they're not checking their school emails over the summer. For many, it was just sort of a word of mouth process that they have a friend whose parent was a teacher, and so that's where they were getting their information. They didn't feel like they had a centralized, clear way to get the questions answered that they had, and therefore, again, underscoring that feeling that it was causing a lot of stress and anxiety. And again, that feeling that they're being left out of key decisions that are going to be of material impact on their lives in a couple of weeks. So there was considerable detail about what the students shared that we were able to capture in the report. And we intended in the report to try to provide sort of those high-level lessons and insights that we learned. But if you have seen the report, I'd really urge you to take a look at the detailed tables that we include in the appendices, because they really provide some of those raw thoughts and feelings that the students shared that really kind of show how vulnerable they're feeling with respect to school starting back up in the fall. And what's next for this project? Obviously, our immediate focus is really sharing this information with school leaders in Marathon County and beyond. And we're doing this in as many ways as we possibly can, by sharing the report, talking with school leaders, talking with organizations, asking other organizations to share the information. Most importantly, we hope that students will hear that they want school leaders to seek their input and include their voices in their plans going forward. And what we would really like to do, and we think this is a substantial and significant opportunity, is to follow up with the student participants in this project later this fall and or next spring to find out, what was the experience like? How did it meet your expectations? What surprised you? What went well? What didn't go well? Did you feel like the things that you communicated in this process actually made a difference in the context of your school? And what areas do you think schools really stepped up and did well? And I think it's really important to emphasize that the students really acknowledge the hard work and efforts that teachers in schools invested in their learning in the spring, and that they were investing in over the summer to help provide them with the best opportunity that they could, and hope that by sharing these thoughts that the situation can be improved going forward. We also think that the model, the student focus group model, I think exceeded expectations from my perspective, from a research standpoint, in terms of providing a really efficient and easy format for kids from different areas to come together and talk to each other. I know for many, this may have been one of the few opportunities that they had maybe to hear how students in Athens or Abbotsford or Colby, for example, were feeling about things that they were also experiencing in maybe the DC Everest or the Wausau communities. And I think maybe the students realized they had more commonalities and similarity to other students in other areas than they thought. So we think there's an opportunity to expand this to other areas of the state going forward. A silver lining of all of this is, for many students, I think COVID-19 has helped them realize the value of school. And one student really did a nice job summing it up and said that no matter how kids may shape it, the reality is that kids do like school and they need school, and that there are a lot of students where their safe place is found at school. And this was a really hopeful message that despite all the negativity of COVID and all of the disruption in their lives, they quickly realized, what they had was taken away and how badly they want it back. And with that, I'll pause and turn it over to Eric to try to moderate, some questions or discussion of this topic in the time that we have left.
Thank you so much, Sharon. We'd now like to turn the time over to you to ask questions or perhaps make comments. If you have a question or comment, I think the most efficient thing might be just to type it up quickly or some shorthand version, and I'll call on you. Or if you just want to, signal to me through the chat function that you have a question, I'll turn to you. And then as you're thinking about what your questions might be, here's a few thought questions that we have, you can consider. We'd like to, first of all, have your reactions and comments and questions, obviously. We're interested to know how this information squares with what you are thinking or hearing in your community about return to school issues. Does this kind of square up with that? Does it differ? We'd be curious to know. Did you hear something here that you didn't already know? I know some people probably heard a lot of things that confirmed things they were thinking, but is there anything you heard that you didn't know or that surprised you? Is there anything that you're hearing in your community that was not reflected in these focus group findings? And I guess, did you hear anything today that made you think about doing something differently or think differently about the return to school experience in the fall? So I'm just kind of buying time a little bit here for you to potentially put your questions in the chat. A last thought question might be, would there be any value in your opinion in continuing to gather this kind of information throughout the school year? Are there some other ways to capture student voices that we didn't think about as we progress during this school year? So with that, I'm going to kind of turn it over to all of you for questions or comments. I think Jennifer has to leave, but she did post here everything everybody sees. Yes, please continue to gather student voices across Marathon County throughout the year.
I guess, Eric, I'd be interested if anybody wanted to unmute and make a comment or ask a question. I really am interested in anyone's reactions to this information. Anything that surprised you, feel free to unmute and pop in. I'd love to hear feedback.
I'll ask a specific question. I'll get back to one of the questions we asked. Did these findings pretty much confirm what you already thought you knew or do know or felt? Jeff, I see you have a comment there. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I was just really impressed with the thoughtful and insightful reflection of the students. And I think it always shows, unfortunately, that often adults feel like they always know best. And that in situations like this, as in a lot of work with people in general, that sometimes assumptions are made without actually talking with the people that are impacted by them. And so the study gave at least these students an opportunity to share, how they felt about what was happening. So insightful. And so much can be learned from this that sometimes gets overlooked by decision makers.
Thank you, Jeff. Krista, would you mind asking your question out loud? I don't know if you're on mute still, or would you prefer that I read it? I'm going to go ahead and read it, unless or until Krista chimes in. Will there be any more surveys of students as school gets going or midway through the school year?
That is our hope and our intention. If resources allow and if we can mobilize the resources to do this, we think that it would be essential to be able to follow up with students and to try to do this on an ongoing basis. And that's something that we'll be working on over the next couple of weeks to try to continue, find ways to continue with this, or other ways to give students a voice in this whole process. So that's a great question.
Paula or Aiden, would either of you want to elaborate a little bit on your comments?
Hi, this is Aiden. I just wanted to say, just in working with teens and young people throughout Marathon County, thinking ahead to our future and how this is one situation of a pandemic, and there have been predictions that we may see things like this in the future. We've certainly seen things like this in the past, and as our world is rapidly changing, just what a great opportunity to utilize this crisis and bring young people into the conversations, into the planning process, and help nurture and empower them as future leaders through their own lives, through their own communities.
Yeah, and I think, along those lines of what you mentioned, I think a couple of things that came out of the discussions that are related to that are sort of two things. Several students mentioned how this whole crisis brought them closer to their family. And so maybe that's, an unintended consequence of this was really helping some families maintain those connections. But also, I think while we all recognize that the virtual learning was a solution, a temporary solution to this pandemic problem, I think for many students, they expressed some very real thoughts and feelings that this is something that they would see as beneficial on a longer term basis, and that they felt like schools should maybe see this as an opportunity to provide maybe a different learning model on a more consistent basis for those students that really benefited from it. I mean, this is just an anecdote, but there was one young man who really loved the virtual learning environment at home. And one of the reasons he expressed that he loved learning from home was that if he got stuck on something that he was working on, or something felt like it was getting overwhelming, he could take a break and just cuddle with his dog for a few minutes. And just having that opportunity to just shift his focus just for a few minutes and spend some time with his dog was enough to be able to go back and really focus on his work and get it done. And I think the exact words that he used were, some kids could thrive in a virtual learning environment. And this was a middle school student. And, he had that insight that this could be an opportunity for a different kind of learning for some students.
If you have anyone else has any comments or questions, we'd love to have you just go ahead and, as Sharon said, and unmute and go ahead and share.
Hi, this is Jeff. One other comment, I guess. Probably the people that work in schools and our educators, they know this already, but I think the study reinforces the concept that schools are much more than just a place where kids learn. That there was some comments about the safety that school provides, and the element of family and social, those connections. And I think we've heard a lot about that as this has continued on. But I think the study reinforces the value that schools have for children beyond just the educational aspects. So I think that the study does a nice job of highlighting that as well.
Okay, I don't know if anyone has seen Sue's comment, but she says she's on a computer with no microphone. So she's impressed with the study, not sure there are any surprises in the report, but it comes from the students and gives them a voice. So she's appreciative of that. And proud to have financially supported the study. Thank you, Sue, and the Community Foundation. Rob, I'm going to put you on the spot for just a minute. We have Rob from Wisconsin Public Radio. Just from your perspective as a journalist, is there anything that you, questions that you have or comments about what you're hearing? I don't know if Rob's able to unmute. Okay, well, until or unless that happens, we'll continue on. If anyone else has any questions or comments. So, go ahead.
Oh, this is Rachel Podolsky, and echo all the comments about the great work of this study, the importance of student voice, and really impressed with how quickly you pulled together the findings. It's nice to see. I would agree that it's maybe not anything we didn't know or assume, but I particularly appreciated kind of highlighting the bright spots as we're in these unprecedented times and our systems have kind of been blown up. I think there are lots of opportunities for reimagining and improving various aspects of how our systems and our organizations work. And in that vein, one point that really stuck out to me is the sleep aspect, the flexible scheduling. The student who said, you know, man, it was such a bummer when my teacher scheduled an early morning meeting. And if we really dig into sleep science and adolescent circadian rhythms, there's a lot of support there that the adolescent brain needs additional sleep, and they tend to have a circadian rhythm that is shifted later, going to bed later, waking up later. And I don't know about Marathon County, but certainly down here in the Appleton-Oshkosh area, most of our schools are starting pretty early. And we've heard similar things about, with the virtual learning environment, the ability to do work at times that were convenient for just their own rhythms, kind of setting their own lifestyle. So any additional thoughts or comments that you heard from the students, or how we could further frame and highlight that opportunity back to schools?
Yeah, that was a real strong message, especially from the high school students. There was one young man who felt strongly that schools should be banned from having meetings before 8 in the morning on WebEx. And I mean, he said it kind of jokingly, but he was also very serious. And yeah, that need to balance very real needs for sleep with the teacher's needs to get students engaged and going for the day. I guess, you know, there's a real dilemma. But in every discussion that came up about sleep, and it came up in every focus group, 5 different groups, different kids, it was tied to improving their general mental health. And I think it really is an opportunity to maybe rethink the whole scheduling approach. I mean, in our area here, you know, some students are on the bus shortly after 6 in the morning, in some cases. So I definitely am glad you honed in on that finding, because it was a very real benefit to the learning environment from the spring that students, I think, will miss if they go back to the rigid, you know, 7 to 3 schedule and even the students that were returning to school in a completely virtual environment were very concerned that they would have to do what they call virtual school in a rigid schedule that mirrored the school schedule. That because the schools hadn't yet shared with them what their plans would be, they were worried that they would have to wake up, check in with their homeroom at 7:45, then go on to an online meeting in science, and then an online meeting in math, and it was going to replicate the school day, but while they were at home. And that kind of situation was very concerning, if that's what indeed a virtual learning environment was going to be for them.
Yeah, I think I'd like to echo, this is Eric, I'd like to echo that. I'm glad you brought that up, Sharon, because I think that was definitely a concern, this idea that we have to be rigid to mirror the school day if the school is going to take place from home. Having said that, I don't think students fully had grappled with the trade-offs that they themselves had identified, right? So for example, Sharon mentioned earlier that students wanted routine and structure. They clearly stated that, but at the same time, they didn't want it to be absolutely rigid and flexible. And I think it's a challenge, right, for any school, any teacher or group of teachers to figure out, how do we balance those two things, right? I mean, if we have to have a scheduled, routinized day where we know that the teacher is going to be available at a certain time, then there has to be an element of rigidity to that. At the same time, students themselves said, it was really frustrating in the spring when I needed help with something and I couldn't get it because I couldn't access the teacher when I needed the teacher. And so this is a real challenge and dilemma, and I don't envy the fact that schools have to figure this out, but I think a more sort of definite attempt to address this and grapple with what would be an appropriate balance is critical. We might have time for one more question, but we want to respect time, and so we're definitely going to end here in about a minute. Does anyone have any last questions or burning thoughts they'd like to share?
Just to put in one additional plug for this sleep idea, because it is something that our project is looking at. Sleep is critical for mental health, mental and physical health. And there's some national resources from the Start School Later campaign, endorsed by CDC, American Academy of Pediatrics, and others that essentially support what that student said. There should be no formal school activities before 8:30 a.m. for high schoolers. And there's sample bell schedules and athletic schedules and ways to make that work. Papers on papers of the benefits of additional sleep and shifting the school day later, which, you know, certainly plenty of barriers there too, transportation, not to discount any of the challenges of systems change. But if any folks on the call are interested in reading more about that, Start School Later has a lot of really great information available.
Thank you.
Well, Sharon, we're out of time. Would you like to say any concluding thoughts as we go out here?
Yep. So I want to thank everyone again. I would appreciate if any of you on the call know anybody that you think might benefit from the report. Feel free to share it within your organizations or with outside of your organizations. If you need a copy of the report, you can email me, or it's on the WIP's website. And if you have any questions, or one of the things that's most important to Eric and I is that we do work that has an impact. And if, as you're processing this information, if you're thinking about it, if you have thoughts on anything that you took away from this or will take away from it, I would really love it if you'd shoot me an email and just let me know how you think this might help you have an impact on students' experiences, or if you have ideas for how we might be able to continue with this kind of project in the future. And I want to thank everyone for making time to listen to this today. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.